Finding your way back. There are periods when I seem to disappear from my own life a little. Nothing dramatic necessarily happens. I simply stop doing the things that usually make me feel like myself. I write less. I postpone things I would normally look forward to. A routine that once felt natural starts feeling strangely difficult. At first, I tell myself I just need a few days. Then, a few days become a few weeks. And somewhere along the way, starting again begins to feel like a task in itself. What surprises me is that I've done these things before. I know how to begin. I have evidence that I can do them. And yet somehow returning feels harder than starting ever did. I have often wondered why. If I never writ- if I had never written regularly, never built a routine, or never experienced that rhythm, perhaps starting would feel intimidating because everything was unfamiliar. But after you've already built something, you expect the way back to be easier. Instead, there is a strange psychological weight to returning. You remember the rhythm you had. You remember how capable you felt. You can see the distance between where you are and where you were. And suddenly you're not simply beginning again. You are beginning again while remembering what it felt like to be further ahead. Sorry. The version of me I remember. When I think about getting into a routine, rather getting back into a routine, my mind rarely begins with where I am. It goes backward. I remember how consistently I was writing, how much I was getting done, or how easily something once fitted into my day. Without consciously deciding to, I make that version of myself the standard against which I judge today. Instead of asking what is possible now, I find myself asking why I am not already where I was. That is where the anchoring effect becomes interesting. We tend to rely on existing reference points when making judgments, and my previous versions become the reference point. Instead of seeing today as a new starting point, I measure it against yesterday's achievement. The anchor makes the gap feel larger than it actually may be. I'm not necessarily struggling with what I need to do. I'm struggling with the distance between who I am today and who I remember being. It feels like I have lost something. There is something particularly frustrating about stepping away from a routine I worked hard to establish. If I had never built the habit, I would simply be beginning. But then I built momentum and then lost it. I can feel the absence of that momentum. I remember how good it felt to have it, which makes not having it feel like a loss. The first step back can therefore carry much more emotional weight than the first step ever did. That is where loss aversion often offers an interesting lens. We tend to experience losses more strongly than equivalent gains. Losing momentum can therefore feel more significant than the effort required to rebuild it. The task itself has not necessarily become harder. What has changed is the meaning attached to it. I am no longer simply building something. I feel as though I'm trying to recover something that was already mine. The pause has quietly become the routine. The longer I stay away, the more familiar the absence becomes. The first few days of a break feel temporary. Eventually, doing less stops feeling like a break and starts feeling like normal life. There is no dramatic decision to stop. There is simply another day when I did not return, followed by another. The strange thing is that continuing not to do something eventually requires less thought than starting again. That is the status quo bias at work. Once a state becomes our current reality, we tend to favor maintaining it rather than changing it. The longer I stay away, the more normal staying away begins to feel. The help that helps explain why returning can require more effort than expected. I'm not only restarting an old behavior, I'm interrupting a new pattern that has quietly taken its place. The comeback becomes a project. When I finally decide that enough is enough, my instinct is often to compensate. If I miss several weeks, I want to make up for them. I want to get back to my old pace quickly, restore the routine, and prove to myself that the interruption did not matter. The plan feels motivating when I make it because it gives me the satisfaction of imagining everything back on track. Then reality arrives. I discover that returning takes time. Energy does not immediately return because I have decided it should. The ambitious plan starts feeling like another obligation, and falling short on it can make the original pause feel even more significant. That is where planning fallacy can creep in. We tend to underestimate the time and effort required to complete things, particularly when we focus on the outcome rather than the obstacles along the way. Our comeback can therefore become unnecessarily ambitious. Instead of making returning easier, I create a standard that makes falling short almost inevitable. Sometimes I just need a new beginning. I have noticed that sometimes a particular date makes starting again feel easier. A Monday, a new month, the beginning of a new project. There is something psychologically satisfying about being able to draw a line and say, this is where I begin again. Nothing external has necessarily changed, but somehow the act of naming a new beginning creates movement. This is the fresh start effect. Temporal landmarks can create a sense of separation between the person we were and the person we want to become. That separation can make goals feel more achievable. Perhaps that is why we instinctively wait for Mondays, birthdays, New Year's, and new chapters. We are not necessarily waiting for circumstances to change. We are waiting for the story around them to change. Perhaps starting again feels harder because it's not really starting. It is returning with a memory of what came before. We compare ourselves with an earlier version, feel the loss of momentum, become comfortable with the pause, and then expect the comeback to happen quickly. By the time we finally begin, we have turned a simple first step into judgment on whether we are still capable of being who we were. But perhaps coming back was never supposed to mean recovering, exactly where we let off. Maybe the goal is not to recreate the old version of ourselves, but to find a way forward from the person we are now. The pause becomes part of the story rather than something that has to be erased. Sometimes finding your way back is not about becoming who you were again, it is about discovering that you can begin from here. How might this show up at work? The same thing happens professionally. A leader returning after a difficult period may compare current performance with the previous peak. Someone returning from leave may feel pressure to immediately operate at their old pace. A person moving into a new role may struggle because they are measuring their earlier performance against the years of experience in their previous one. Even teams can become attached to old rhythms after a period of disruption because the familiar feels easier than rebuilding something new. Perhaps the most useful workplace question is not how quickly we can get back to where we are, but what would make it easier to begin from where we are now. A person does not necessarily need to recover their old rhythm. A team does not necessarily need to recreate the old way of working. Sometimes the most productive return is not a return to the past at all, but the beginning of something that fits the present.